He thought his badge made him untouchable, until the woman he mocked walked into the courtroom and sat on the bench. It was a quiet Friday evening in Brantville, Missouri, the kind where the streets slow down, but the assumptions don't. Sergeant Logan Myers, 43, a cop with nearly 2 decades of service and an ego sharpened by unchecked authority, parked outside a small gas station on the city's west side. That's where he saw her, Danielle Harper, 39, a black woman in business attire, alone, refueling her car. To Logan, she didn't fit the neighborhood, and that was enough. He approached, hand resting lazily near his belt, and asked her what she was doing there. No greeting, no reason, just suspicion wrapped in sarcasm. "You people love acting like you don't know the rules," he muttered, asking her to leave the property as if he owned it. Danielle didn't argue. She didn't raise her voice or flash credentials. She simply nodded once, got in her car, and drove off. What Logan didn't know was that Danielle wasn't just another motorist passing through. She was a recently appointed county judge. And the next time they'd meet, she wouldn't be the one answering questions. Sergeant Logan Myers was the kind of cop who clocked in early, wrote his reports by the book, and never questioned the way things had always been done. On paper, he was reliable. Off paper, he was a man shaped by years of unchecked authority and quiet enablement. His colleagues knew he had a temper, short, sharp, and particularly unforgiving toward those who didn't fall in line. Complaints had been filed against him: use of excessive tone, racial profiling, unnecessary escalation. But nothing ever stuck. Supervisors dismissed the reports as personality clashes or misunderstandings, and Logan came to believe what many in his position had. His badge didn't just give him authority, it gave him immunity. That belief hardened into something dangerous: the assumption that no one could hold him accountable, especially not a black woman standing alone at a gas pump. When he confronted Danielle Harper that night, he didn't see a professional or a peer. He saw someone who, in his mind, didn't belong, and so he treated her like a problem to be removed. What Logan didn't see was the quiet defiance behind Danielle's calm eyes, or the way her hand paused for a beat before starting the car, already memorizing the details of his face, his tone, the subtle threat in his posture. Danielle didn't yell, she didn't resist. But she did return, 10 minutes later, to request the station's exterior surveillance footage, citing an incident she claimed involved misconduct. The attendant handed it over without question. She thanked him, walked back to her vehicle, and drove off into the night. What Logan had misjudged wasn't just her presence, it was her power. Danielle Harper wasn't just a passerby with a complaint. She was a federal attorney with over a decade of courtroom experience, recently nominated and confirmed as a judge for the Brantville County Circuit Court. She'd handled civil rights cases, argued before state supreme courts, and mentored dozens of young lawyers, many of them women of color who had faced the same kind of casual dismissal she just endured. Her calm wasn't passive, it was precision. Years of training had taught her that control wasn't about volume, it was about timing. And this time, she wasn't just walking away with a bruised ego, she was walking away with evidence. Logan didn't realize that his 5-minute act of superiority had just become a turning point in someone else's story. A story with legal implications, public scrutiny, and a mirror held up to everything he thought he understood about power. The woman he mocked wasn't just a memory. She was about to become the judge in a case that would challenge not only his actions, but the very system that had allowed him to believe he was above the consequences. And she wouldn't need to raise her voice to do it. 1 week later, Logan Myers found himself sitting stiffly at the defendant's table in courtroom 3B of the Brantville County Circuit Court, facing allegations of excessive force during a routine campus stop involving a 19-year-old college student. The complaint was serious: use of unnecessary physical restraint, verbal intimidation, and a failure to follow department de-escalation protocols. But Logan wasn't worried. He'd been through this before. He figured the case would get tossed or settled quietly, just like the others. What he didn't anticipate, what he couldn't have anticipated, was who would be presiding. The door at the side of the courtroom opened, and in walked Judge Danielle Harper, black robe flowing, her posture straight, her expression unreadable. Logan blinked once, then again. His jaw tightened, and for a moment he forgot to breathe. It was her. The woman from the gas station, the one he'd dismissed, mocked, and waved off like she didn't matter. Now she stood above him, holding the authority he thought only belonged to men like him. Danielle took her seat on the bench, adjusted her notes, and gave the courtroom a brief, professional nod. She made no reference to their previous encounter. No mention of the gas station, no personal remark. But Logan could feel it, an invisible tension wrapping around his chest. It wasn't what she said. It was what she didn't have to say. The calm precision in her movements, the way she looked through him rather than at him, made him feel more exposed than any spotlight ever could. It was the first time in years that Logan felt truly scrutinized. Not by a superior, not by a body cam, but by someone who saw past the badge, past the uniform, into the man who had been hiding behind both. Danielle handled the hearing with the same clarity and focus that had earned her the bench. She listened intently to witness testimonies, asked direct but fair questions, and maintained composure throughout. Logan tried to act unfazed, but something was shifting. Every time he glanced up, he caught her gaze. Steady, unwavering. It wasn't angry, it wasn't vengeful. It was something else entirely, a look that said, "I remember." And that haunted him more than any outburst ever could. For years, Logan had thrived on control, of situations, of narratives, of people's fear. But now, seated under the gavel of the very woman he'd tried to diminish, he felt that control slip like sand through his fingers. The irony didn't just sting, it unsettled him. Here was a woman he hadn't even deemed worthy of a full sentence days before, now calmly overseeing the direction of his professional future. Danielle never flinched. She treated the case with impartiality, never once indicating personal bias. But the symmetry of it all was undeniable. What had started as an impulsive abuse of power was now unfolding under the quiet weight of justice. And for the first time, Logan was forced to see the system not as a shield, but as a mirror. A mirror that reflected back not just his actions, but his assumptions, his arrogance, and the simple truth that no one, not even a man with a badge, was beyond accountability. As the hearing progressed, Logan Myers kept waiting for the moment when Judge Danielle Harper would let personal history color her judgment. When she'd break form, when she'd glare, when she'd let the tension hanging between them explode into something unmistakable. But it never happened. Instead, she did the one thing he hadn't anticipated. She remained utterly professional, measured, and fair. Danielle presided over the courtroom with a kind of disciplined grace that Logan had never associated with power before. She allowed both sides to present their arguments without interruption, scrutinized the testimonies with an even hand, and made her rulings based strictly on the law. No shortcuts, no shade, no revenge. And that unsettled him more than if she had screamed. But the real reckoning didn't come from a burst of emotion. It came during the character review segment of the case, when the prosecution submitted Myers's personnel file as supporting evidence. Danielle didn't shy away from the contents. Instead, she read them aloud, line by line, her voice steady but sharp with clarity. There it was, a detailed pattern spanning nearly a decade. Unresolved complaints, repeated warnings, racial profiling allegations swept under the rug, and notes from internal supervisors documenting his hostility during community interactions. Each sentence was a spotlight. Each phrase is a mirror. Logan didn't try to object. He didn't look at his lawyer. He didn't even shift in his seat. He just stared ahead, face tight, as the reality of his career, his legacy, was laid bare before the room. These weren't just words on paper. They were the receipts. And Danielle read them not with malice, but with the weight of truth. She paused for a moment after the last entry, letting the silence settle like dust before speaking. Not as the woman from the gas station, not even as a judge exacting punishment, but as someone who had spent a lifetime defending the dignity of people overlooked by men like him. "Sergeant Myers," she said, her voice firm but free of anger, "we are all here to serve justice. But when you begin to believe that your badge entitles you to strip others of theirs, then the system must remind you. No one is above consequence." The words hung in the air, not shouted, not embellished, just placed, with precision. Logan felt them not in his ears, but in his gut. For years he'd wielded his badge like armor, like permission. He'd walked into situations with the expectation of obedience, of silence, of fear. And until now, it had always worked. Until now, no one had stood at the other end with more authority than he carried. But here she was, not a civilian on the defensive, not a scared woman on the side of the road, but a judge, robed and resolute, demanding nothing but accountability. Danielle didn't gloat. She didn't even glance at him again after that. She simply continued with the hearing, moving through the remainder of the proceedings as if justice, for her, was a habit, not a performance. But Logan had already been stripped of more than position or pride. In that moment, he saw himself clearly, without the badge, without the ego, and for the first time, he understood that the system he thought existed to protect him was actually built to protect the people he'd been trained to serve. He had mistaken silence for acceptance. He had confused authority with immunity. And Danielle Harper had just reminded him, calmly, completely, that real justice doesn't shout, it simply stands. The verdict came down late in the afternoon, after hours of deliberation and a courtroom that had grown quieter with each passing moment. Judge Danielle Harper read the conclusion with the same steady voice she had maintained throughout the hearing. Sergeant Logan Myers was found to have violated established departmental protocols, exhibited a pattern of behavior inconsistent with professional standards, and would be placed on administrative leave pending a full investigation into his prior conduct. His badge would be suspended indefinitely, and an independent review board would reopen multiple complaints that had previously been dismissed without proper inquiry. Logan didn't react. He didn't slam his fist, didn't scoff or shake his head. He simply stood there, rigid in his suit, nodding once, like a man who had finally come face to face with a truth he could no longer outrun. As he walked out of the courtroom, he kept his eyes low, not because he felt humiliated, but because for the first time he truly understood the limits of the power he had once believed infinite. There was no media swarm outside, no public spectacle, just a few reporters murmuring in the hallway and a couple of officers exchanging glances as he passed. Danielle didn't watch him leave. She didn't smile. She didn't follow his exit with a monologue or a pointed remark. Instead, she turned to the next item on the docket, flipping the page as if nothing extraordinary had just occurred. Because for her, it hadn't. It was just another day in court, another case, another opportunity to uphold the law without bias, without ego, without performance. That, more than anything, was what made it powerful. She hadn't used her position to get even. She hadn't mentioned the gas station and hadn't used their history to embarrass or diminish him. In fact, she never even acknowledged their past encounter aloud, because she didn't need to. The justice system had spoken, the facts had been heard, and her role wasn't to punish, it was to restore integrity. That's what Logan hadn't understood until that day. For so long, he had seen justice as a weapon, something wielded from a position of superiority. But Danielle showed him what it looked like as a responsibility, something you carry with humility and discipline even when no one is watching. The transformation wasn't dramatic. Logan didn't fall to his knees or break down in tears. But something in his posture had shifted. The defiance was gone, replaced by a stillness that suggested recognition. A crack had formed in the armor he had built around himself for nearly 2 decades, and now the man beneath it had to reckon with the consequences of what he'd done, and what he'd failed to learn along the way. As for Danielle, she closed the hearing with a brief, formal thank you to both legal teams, then stepped off the bench without a backward glance. Her colleagues knew what had just unfolded, but none of them said a word. They didn't have to. Her actions had said everything. It wasn't about settling a score. It wasn't about making headlines. It was about proving, quietly but unmistakably, that no one is beyond the reach of justice, and that the true strength of the system lies in how it responds not to power, but to truth. And in that courtroom, truth had finally stood taller than the badge. The moment that later went viral wasn't dramatic. There were no microphones, no grand speeches, no reporters crowding the steps outside. It was quiet, almost too quiet for something so powerful. As the courtroom emptied, Judge Danielle Harper stepped down from the bench, gathered her papers, and walked past Logan Myers without hesitation. She paused just long enough to meet his eyes and offered a small, respectful nod. Nothing more. No gloating, no final word. But as she passed him, she said quietly, "I don't need to say anything else. Justice already has." Someone in the hallway captured the moment on their phone, and within hours the clip began making its way across social media. Not because of what she did, but because of what she didn't do. The restraint, the dignity, the quiet power. People commented not on her authority, but on her poise. They weren't applauding vengeance. They were witnessing something deeper, a rare kind of leadership that doesn't seek to humiliate, only to correct. In a world where outrage often drowns out resolution, Danielle Harper's silence said everything. And in that moment, the story became bigger than one courtroom. It became a reflection of something many people recognized, the subtle but profound difference between power and principle. The real lesson wasn't that a bad cop got suspended or that a judge got the last word. It was that justice, when wielded with discipline, doesn't need volume to leave a mark. Danielle didn't destroy Logan. She didn't have to. What broke him wasn't punishment. It was the mirror she held up. For people like Logan, who had lived their careers believing their authority insulated them from consequence, the true reckoning came not from a sentence, but from being seen, truly seen, for who they had become. And it came from someone they once thought didn't matter. Danielle Harper chose the harder path, to respond without ego, to act without spite, and to uphold the very values that others had weaponized against her. Her courage wasn't loud, it was deliberate. Her justice wasn't about headlines, it was about standards. And her power wasn't in her title. It was in the calm, unwavering conviction that doing the right thing never requires raising your voice. For those watching, it was a reminder that the strongest leaders are the ones who don't need to remind you they're in charge. They simply show up, do the work, and let integrity do the talking. And for anyone who has ever been talked down to, dismissed, or underestimated, Danielle Harper didn't just win a case, she proved a point. That you don't have to fight dirty to stand tall. That respect isn't something you demand, it's something you model. And that sometimes the most lasting change doesn't come from confrontation, but from clarity. The kind of clarity that reminds us that justice isn't about punishing the powerful. It's about protecting the principle that no one is above the law, not even the ones who wear the badge. If you believe that justice doesn't have to be loud to be powerful, and that quiet strength, when led by integrity and discipline, can shift entire systems, then this story was for you. Danielle Harper didn't yell, didn't seek revenge, and didn't use her position to humiliate. She simply stepped into the courtroom, did her job with unwavering grace, and let the truth speak for itself. At X Daily Stories, we believe in the power of narratives like these. Stories where people aren't perfect, but they're brave enough to stand their ground. If you believe that real change begins with small moments, a steady gaze, a well-timed word, a quiet but firm choice, then we invite you to be part of this journey. Subscribe to X Daily Stories for more powerful, thought-provoking stories that inspire, uplift, and leave a lasting impact. Because sometimes what people remember most isn't the shout. It's how you stood still and made the world listen.